Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arleth. On This Week, the Trump administration freezes deliveries of arms and military equipment to Ukraine and suspends intelligence sharing. We'll try to make sense of this new strategy being employed by Washington. For this, I'm joined by George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War. But before that, let's watch a digest of the most important news from this week concerning Ukraine.
European leaders on Thursday reinforced their commitment to boosting defense spending and supporting Ukraine amid growing concerns over Russia's ongoing aggression and uncertainty surrounding U.S. policies.
We all want a peace through strength, a just and lasting peace, but a peace from a position of strength.
The leaders have agreed on a proposal to grant fiscal flexibility for defense spending and enable joint borrowing of up to 150 billion euros to strengthen EU military capabilities.
There is no doubt that the war in Ukraine, the new approach of the US administration to Europe, and above all, the arms race started by Russia, this must be obvious to everyone, poses completely new challenges, and Europe must take up this challenge.
The EU leaders also voiced continued support for Ukraine and vowed to continue to provide aid, but one country refused to join the choir: Hungary.
Additional funding is just a theory. We don't know where is the money. So at this moment, we just got information about huge sum of money, which is impossible to generate from the...
Meanwhile, the former Ukrainian army chief presented a rather grim assessment of the situation, saying that Washington's non-recognition of Russia's aggression poses a new challenge for the entire Europe.
This is enough to understand that this is not only Russia and the Axis that is trying to destroy the world order, but the United States of America is actually destroying it completely.
The United States has paused intelligence sharing with Ukraine, a move that could hinder Kyiv's ability to effectively repel Russian forces. CIA Director John Ratcliffe stated that the freeze stemmed from US President Donald Trump's concerns about Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's commitment to a peace settlement with Russia. However, he suggested the pause would be temporary, citing Zelensky's willingness to negotiate, as expressed in a letter to Trump. The decision follows Trump's suspension of military aid to Ukraine, a move welcomed by the Kremlin. Reports suggest the intelligence freeze blocks the Ukrainian side from acquiring real-time targeting data on the Russian forces, but some US allies may continue providing relevant intelligence. Despite the suspension, Bloomberg cited a Ukrainian official who confirmed that Washington is still sharing some intelligence. Day after day, night after night, Russian drones and missiles are roaring through Ukrainian skies. Throughout last week, Russia has launched a series of attacks across Ukraine, resulting in fatalities, injuries, and significant infrastructure damage. In the northern city of Kharkiv, a Russian strike injured 8 people, including a child. The attack left a trail of destruction, further unsettling the city that has already endured extensive damage since the onset of the war. Similarly, in the southern region of Kherson, a Russian drone dropped a bomb on a civilian bus, resulting in 1 death and at least 10 injuries. Although Ukrainian air defenses were able to intercept a large chunk of Russian ordnance, enemy forces continue to launch aerial assaults, leaving many cities vulnerable to unexpected bombardment. A major fire erupted overnight at the Ufimsky oil refinery in Russia's Ufa, located approximately 1,400 kilometers from Ukraine's border. Local authorities reported that the blaze has been successfully extinguished, with no harmful substances detected in the vicinity of the plant. The cause of the fire remains unknown. However, it follows a series of drone strikes by Ukrainian forces targeting Russia's oil industry since the spring of 2024. Russian Telegram channels mentioned that there was an explosion at the refinery prior to the fire breaking out. Ukraine has not issued any comments regarding the incident. The Ufimsky refinery, owned by Bashneft, processes 168,000 barrels of oil per day, primarily sourced from Bashkiria and western Siberia. As one of Russia's largest oil refineries, its location in Ufa, the capital of the Bashkortostan Republic, lying 1,520 kilometers east of Moscow and 550 kilometers north of the border with Kazakhstan, is strategically significant. Starlink has been crucial for Ukraine's military and civilian infrastructure, with around 42,000 terminals supporting battlefield communications, medical facilities, businesses, and aid organizations.
This is the main way to transfer information that we currently have at the moment, which is mobile, which is easy to work with, you can train people on it fast. You do not need a lot of information. You come, install it, turn it on, connect it, and that's all. Your connection is working. If we lose it, it will be a serious blow to our means of communication.
However, concerns have grown following reports that the US allegedly threatened to cut Ukraine's access unless Kyiv reached a deal with Washington over critical mineral resources. A claim SpaceX CEO Elon Musk denied.
This is false. Reuters is lying. They are second only to AP, Associated Propaganda's legacy news liars.
Ukraine has expressed interest in alternative satellite options, including GovSatcom, a shared network of EU government satellites, and IRIS, a future EU constellation expected to be operational in the 2030s. European Parliament member Christoph Gudler has urged the EU to fast-track GovSatcom deployment, suggesting that bypassing the certification process could allow it to serve as a temporary replacement for Starlink, while IRIS is still under development.
And now, joining me to discuss the whirlwind of developments that we've seen concerning the war in Ukraine is George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War. Hello, George, and thank you very much for joining me on Ukraine this week.
Hey, Don. Good afternoon. Good to see you again. Thanks for having me.
All right, now, George, we are all running around like chickens with our heads cut off here in Europe, trying to make sense of the current strategy that the United States is employing, trying to get to the table. What do you make of the recent developments concerning, President Zelensky at the White House, all the way to this strategy that's being employed to get us to the table and start negotiations?
Yeah. I mean, truthfully, I'm also trying to wrap my head around it. The thing that makes it most difficult is the fact that administration officials have not had a consistent line on what There's been some relatively good proposals, there's been some worse proposals, and I'm still trying to figure it out. The latest that we know right now is that President Trump appears to finally be orienting around wanting to amplify pressure on Russia. He posted today, actually, that he is considering levying some sanctions and tariffs against the Russian Federation should they not be interested in peace, which I'm quite pleased about because the approach so far has been to make concessions to Russia and increase leverage and increase pressure on the Ukrainians by suspending aid to the Ukraine, by cutting intelligence sharing. And so, which I don't necessarily think is the correct approach. But I hope that the president will now start putting some pressure on Russia. Now, in terms of what different administration officials have said, let's talk about some of the things that are good. Marco Rubio has stated that he wants Ukraine to emerge a sovereign state. Pete Hegseth on February 12th, when he went to Ramstein, talked about having a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine, which I think is a good thing. Just yesterday, on Thursday, Keith Kellogg was talking about how we should not use the Istanbul Accords of 2022 to be the guidepost for the deal. That would have implied Ukrainian serious cuts to the Ukrainian military, essentially a demilitarization of Ukraine and Ukraine being permanently neutral. So there are some positions that the Trump administration officials have talked about which are stronger. And I hope now that we've put pressure on the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians have signaled very clearly that they are willing to make some concessions, that we now actually extract those concessions from the Russian side to get to the table. I think what Trump will soon find is that the Russians are unwilling to make any kinds of concessions, at which point I hope the administration will resume the spigot of aid to Ukraine and arm them to the hilt.
Right, and such a notion has been out there for a long time. I know we've been speculating over what Donald Trump would do for months now. One thing that struck me is Marco Rubio has said on various occasions in interviews, especially after the blow-up at the White House, that the current approach and what we see as, what President Zelensky described as Donald Trump being in this dense information bubble, well, Rubio is essentially saying that President Biden wasn't able to meet with Vladimir Putin at all for the last 3 years, even though he had requested to do so. And therefore, the current administration is trying to woo Russia to get to the table. And in order to do that, they have to, I guess, make these concessions on some of the talking points, such as the invasion of Ukraine. And of course, we saw in the United Nations the vote, not to have aggression in the terminology there in that resolution. So could this be a successful strategy? And B, if we do get them to the table, what tells us that they're going to have any desire whatsoever to negotiate?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be a successful strategy in the long term, to be frank. I think the president has to go through a journey of discovery in talking to the Russians, in discovering that actually it's the Russians that are the obstacle to peace here. Putin can stop the war whenever he wants to, but his demands are officially and continue to be officially that the Ukrainians cede territory that the Russians currently don't occupy, four provinces of Ukraine, and that Ukraine undertake a series of other concessions. I think Trump doesn't understand the Russian negotiating position very well, but once he actually realizes to the extent to which the Russians are unwilling to compromise, that will then force President Trump's hand to move in a different direction. And with regards to the president's statements and Marco Rubio's statements about, well, the Biden administration didn't talk to Russia, I think it's very important to define the time period. The Biden administration didn't talk to Russia after Russia conducted the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But the Biden administration undertook an unprecedentedly intense series of diplomatic talks with the Russians in late 2021 and early 2022 in order to try to evade a larger conflict. And during those discussions, there were a variety of concessions that the U.S. offered, including putting a moratorium a temporary suspension on Ukraine's invitation to NATO for 10 years and a variety of other things that the Russians ultimately refused. And so when the Biden administration realized that actually no matter what they could try to do to talk to the Russians objectives were actually always just raw conquest, they then realized that, okay, we have to make the subsequent strategic adjustments and not talk to them. I think Trump will come to the same conclusion.
Lately, the now Ukrainian ambassador to the UK, General Zaluzhny, said that the United States has upended the global order, the post-World War II global order. Do you think that we're living in a new world now, and that the United States is leaving Europe in a difficult but necessary position to indeed finally take care of their own security?
Yeah, I'm hesitant to make such a broad statement necessarily so far. I'm willing to accept the thesis with the assumption that the United States indeed abandons our European allies. We decouple from NATO. We abandon and throw Ukraine to the wolves. I think there'd be no intellectually honest way to defend that nothing had changed had we done that. But so far, I'm not prepared to say that that's the decision that the president's taken. There still are American forces in Europe. We still have tripwire forces in the Baltic states. We can resume, and I believe the plan is to resume military and intelligence sharing with the Ukrainians once we iron out the details of the minerals deal. And now we know that the Ukrainians and the Americans are going to speak in Riyadh on Tuesday. So it's bad. I think there's been several missteps in the strategy so far. But I don't know that we're at that critical inflection point just quite yet, but we're certainly flirting with it.
Why Riyadh? Why are these talks taking place in Riyadh? Is it an attempt to combine the two conflicts, the one that we see with Israel in the Middle East and, of course, with Ukraine? And why is this taking place exactly in the Middle East, in your opinion?
Yeah. Well, you would normally want to pick a neutral place to hold these talks. When Biden and the Russians were having their similar talks back in 2021, a lot of those happened in Geneva in Switzerland. The Middle Eastern states, in particular, the Saudis, have been positioning themselves as a major international mediator for talks, that sort of thing. And given that sort of, Istanbul has been taken, that has a previous process associated with it, that was unsuccessful. Geneva had already happened and was unsuccessful. Sort of, you had to go to another place. So I'm hesitant to necessarily try to connect the conflicts to, other conflicts in the Middle East. But I think it's just the Saudis are welcoming, and they're trying to position Saudi Arabia as essentially a hub for mediation on the global stage.
Now, you mentioned the freeze in weapons deliveries from the United States and a halt in intel sharing. We don't know exactly the extent. Perhaps you do. How long do you think that this may last, and what effect will it have on Ukraine and its ability to defend itself here in the very short term?
Yeah, I hope that it doesn't last long. I mean, if it's going to last a long time, it's going to have serious detrimental effects to Ukraine's frontline forces. I suspect it will last no lesser than until Tuesday. I mean, all eyes are going to be watching to see what meeting happens between the U.S. and the Ukrainians in Riyadh on Tuesday. But I suspect it'll last until then. In terms of the battlefield effects, it has immediate effects. I've read reports. I'll just be very clear. I'm not privy to classified information. I don't know exactly the extent to what we were sharing, but I've read reports that the United States intelligence apparatus was helping the Ukrainians' early warning system for air threats. For example, the Russians, when they conduct missile and airstrikes across Ukraine, one of their air bases is deep in the interior of Russia. The strategic Engels 2 air base, where the Russians will fly their, Tupolev 95 blackjack bombers, which will then fire air-launched cruise missiles. I believe the United States was in the process of reconnoitering that site and giving the Ukrainians head notice when the missiles would start flying. That way, the Ukrainians could blare the air sirens and instruct civilians to take cover in shelters and that sort of thing. I think it's unconscionable to cease sending that sort of important intelligence forewarning, especially as it could help prevent civilian deaths. But that's one of the aspects. The other part of it is a battlefield application. The Ukrainians depend on American intelligence sharing for dynamic targeting. That is, targeting of objects that are not stationary, that move around. It could be military logistics depots. It could be key personnel like officers. Could be headquarters, which are camouflaged and that are moving, especially as troops throughout the theater will redeploy. And this is not just within Russia, but also within occupied Ukraine. That has an immediate effect, and it will make the Russians' sustainment efforts and protection efforts more effective, and it will degrade the effectiveness of weapons that the Ukrainians already have, such as the HIMARS and other kinds of artillery, and even Ukraine's homemade drones. Ukrainians still will be able to target long-range objects that are stationary, like oil and gas depots and terminals. Those are just known. But if they're trying to hit a moving target, that'll degrade their forces. And also, not to mention the morale impact. Morale is extremely important for frontline infantry and frontline soldiers. And knowing that you're not being given the tools, and the tools that you've relied on for a long time are being taken away from you, does not have a positive effect on your warfighting capability from the morale perspective.
In the current environment where we've seen the United States somewhat withdrawal, and of course in hopes to get to some kind of negotiating table and talks and what have you, how does Europe fill the gap at the current moment? Does this lie squarely on Europe's shoulders, do you think, at this point in time?
Not at this time. I believe there is still a window of opportunity for the United States to essentially refinance and remortgage its approach to supporting Ukraine. I think that's what the president's trying to do. But Europe needs to step up and play a larger role for certain. And there is a tremendous opportunity for Europe to be able to take care of this problem, keep the Ukrainians in the fight, and really push the Russians to make concessions and back off of their maximalist demands. I will remind the audience that pre-war, Russia's GDP is about equivalent to that of Italy, or about that of New York State. The European Union absolutely can do this economically, human potential-wise, but it needs to make the proper capital allocations and reallocations in order to be able to sustain a war effort. Europe's defense industrial base, their ability to produce military equipment, the size of their militaries are far too small and underdeveloped because they have been free riding off of American security guarantees for decades. Europe needs to rapidly rearm. I suspect the European Commission is going to do some unprecedented moves in the coming weeks and start just straight up allocating subsidies for the expedited development of Europe's defense industrial base, which will be very important and much needed. Now, the real question is, can the European surge capabilities soon enough so that if the United States does not play this strategic bridging role while the Europeans build up their defenses, will the Ukrainians not be left out to dry in the meantime?
And finally, George, this minerals deal, we've seen signs that Ukraine's willing to sign it, then there's a little bit of reluctance. Do you think that Ukraine needs to push through with this deal? Do you think it will please the administration? And do you think that it will provide some skin in the game for the Americans, at least, in terms of the security guarantees that Ukraine seeks? Although it may not completely achieve that goal, will it at least do so partially?
The mineral deal is extremely important for Ukraine's survival. I think this has been lost in the reporting. A lot of the Western reporting has framed the mineral deal as being sort of Trump's grand master scheme on how to economically exploit Ukraine. But it was actually the Ukrainians' idea to do the mineral deal. I mean, it was Yermak who pitched it to the new administration because the Ukrainians assessed that this is a way that they can try to make a compelling case to this administration on how to remain connected to Ukraine. And so therefore, for that reason, it needs to go through. I think Trump still wants to sign it. His recent statements on social media indicate that he wants to sign it. I hope they will discuss signing it on Tuesday. And if we do sign it and we get a version of the deal that is not the raw, naked economic colonialism and exploitation of Ukraine, one that does have the umbilical cord that will provide some of the financing and the financial investment necessary to turn the spigot back on and have American military support continue going to Ukraine, that will be extremely important. The other thing that's going to be very important, in addition to the minerals deal, will be finding alternative financing resources to keep the aid flowing. The other big source of money that we're looking at, of course, is the Russian frozen assets, much of which are currently held by Belgium. The European authorities, the Belgians, they need to not just go after the interest, but they need to seize the principal and put that towards either European or American defense manufacturing for weapons for the Ukrainians.
Exactly. Well, we've had 3 years to do it, so the time is now. George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War, thank you very much for joining me. We appreciate your analysis very much. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Don. Always a pleasure.
And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for all the latest developments in the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching, and see you then. Goodbye.